Now, let me spend the rest of the minutes talking about changing economic and demographic realities in an urban and industrial society in the United States, okay, during the progressive era, which means from 1900 to 1930. By 1920s, the United States was the richest country on earth, a world leader in farm and manufacturing output. So 1920s, we are the richest country on earth, okay? So, and we have still remained the richest country, okay? But again, I want to draw your attention to this, as I mentioned in the earlier lecture, that do not assume that even though we are the richest country, this wealth has benefited everybody. Because remember that in the 1920s, we still had Jim Crow. We have separate but equal and things like that, okay? And then women just got the right to vote at that time. They just got the right to vote in 1920. But there are still other people who are really struggling, Native Americans and things like that. So just bear in mind that whereas productivity has increased and we have become a world leader, this still remains an important challenge. And it's important for you to remember this, because remember that even after the Second World War, there are black people who went and participated in the war fighting for freedom, but then when they came back to the United States, they had to live under segregation, okay, because segregation wasn't abolished until after the Civil Rights Act and then Brown versus Board of Education and things like that, okay? And then revolutions in technology and communication created a united America. So what does this mean? Creating a united America through revolution and technology simply means communication, either through, for instance, automobile. Okay, you can live in one part of the city, you move to another part of the city, you can travel from one location to the other. You can call somebody using any kind of means of communication, or there are TV programs that you can be in the Twin Cities and then Minnesota and then be watching what is happening in another part of the world as if you are there or something like that. I remember the first time I went out of the United States was when I went for a visit at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I was going to go to Vanderbilt Divinity School at that time. And when I went there in the hotel, I was amazed that what I was watching in my house on TV here in St. Paul, Minnesota is the same thing that is available in Nashville, Tennessee. And I said, well, this is interesting because you can be in any part of America and be watching the same thing on TV, actually, okay, depending on the channel, because some of these channels are just really national. So technology can bring us together. And then these roads, communication, you can, with better roads, you can move goods from one region of the country to the other and all those kind of things, okay? So technology played a very important role in uniting America. And there are some countries in the world that are not as united as they are because of this lack of infrastructure, either in terms of roads or technology. And then three, by 1930, 40% of households had telephones. Okay, now this is 1930, 40% of households had telephones. Actually, when you go to some parts of the world today, up to now, in some parts, in some regions, not up to 40% of the population will have a phone. And even if they have a phone, you will find out that the phone they are using is not the sophisticated type that many of us have. And then and this is why, by the way, the reason why I brought this up is simply because when we say like we are living in the postmodern period, postmodern in the United States doesn't mean postmodern in some parts of the world, because we are just looking at our own evolution. Yes, the US can be in the postmodern era, and even in the US, maybe if you go to some rural communities or something like that, they may not be in the postmodern age or something like that. Between 1899 and 1929, output of manufacturing increased 273%. So output of manufacturing, what I want to emphasize here is productivity. There's no society that can develop without increasing its productivity. I don't care what that society really is. This is something that is well established, okay? Because even if the population of that society is not increasing, but the demands, and what I mean by the demands is that you can have just 3 people or 5 people and there is no additional people, but if their consumption increase, you can imagine that it is going to increase It will lead to increased demand. So without increased productivity in society, that society is probably going to lag behind. Okay? So I think it is impressive here that productivity in the United States since at that time was really impressive. Okay, and it is still going on. But as we discussed much earlier, or as I highlighted much earlier, an important issue here that you have to bear in mind is that we have to complement, or we have to balance increased productivity with fairness in distribution. And as I said, fairness in distribution doesn't mean everybody's going to get the same thing, but just create a situation where people will feel it is fair. I don't have to be a millionaire or something like that, but I can feel really satisfied living where I am in the United States, that it's a good life, right? Okay. And then new power supplies, greater mechanization and scientific management were developed to increase productivity. So how do we increase that productivity? Okay. In some parts of the world, people expect that they're going to increase productivity through miracles. They go and pray and then they expect miracles. But here, what the text is clearly showing you is that the reason why America was able to increase her productivity is that power supplies. Okay? You go to some countries, maybe you wouldn't be able to have recording for 2 hours without the electricity going off. And when the electricity goes off, some people, if they are in church or some place of worship, they will say it is the devil. Okay? Not knowing that there's a science behind having electricity. And you can have electricity. There's nothing wrong in people praying or believing in God or whatever. But things like just providing electricity, you can go to countries that are not believers of any of the Abrahamic religion, but they are able to provide good electricity. Okay? And they have been able to increase their productivity. They have been able to use scientific principles to increase the management capacity of their economy. Japan is a very good example of that. Okay, and Japan is not a country that believes in any of the Abrahamic religion. Actually, most Japanese are like have something like ancestral religion or something like that. Okay, so it's very important for us to think about this because many people in other developing countries have not taken this really very seriously. I remember reading a book where Jawaharlal Nehru, one of the first prime ministers of India, and then Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, the first president of Ghana, also saying that developing countries cannot decolonize themselves if they have not mastered modern science and technology. Okay? So for developing countries to really become developed, they have to master modern science and technology. If they stay there and all they do is to produce raw materials, export it, and then import manufactured goods, these two people said they are never going to consider themselves decolonized. And by the way, if you think about this very, very carefully, there's a report written by Alexander Hamilton called Report on Manufactures. This report on manufactures was a place where Alexander Hamilton argued that he didn't agree with Adam Smith, some of Adam Smith's argument about this idea of comparative advantage and things like that, because Adam Smith's book was written in, The Wealth of Nations was written in 1776. And in 1776, the United States was still an agrarian society. Industrialization did not take off in the United States until after the Civil War, towards the end of the 19th century. Okay, so Alexander Hamilton was making the case that if the United States at that time was going to go with the argument of Adam Smith, then we will just be producing agricultural products or whatever, and they will be doing manufacturing in Europe, and then we will import the manufactured goods. But if we do that in the United States, then it means the United States will be less developed, because if we are just engaged in agriculture, it will not encourage us to develop our productive capacity to a higher level as it is today. So Alexander Hamilton fought very, very thoroughly about this. At some point, he even imposed, or he convinced the United States to impose tariff. Tariff means extra taxes or whatever that people pay on imported goods, because he wanted the infant industries in the United States that were just emerging or growing vis-a-vis compared to those of Europe to have the opportunity to compete. Okay, so tariff simply means if you're going to import a foreign product, you will have to pay more which means there's an incentive for you to buy the locally produced manufactured good, which means you are nurturing the local industries. Okay, so again, the United States was laid on this solid foundation of scientific management to increase productivity, and then per capita GDP rose 73% in the first 30 years of the century. Again, this is an example of increased productivity, although I would argue that this increased productivity may not be across the board in all sectors. Some sectors were more productive than others. And then the population increased in the first 30 years of the century from 47 million to 123 million, with 56 living in urban areas. So you can see the changes that have been taking place in the United States at that time. And as I said much earlier, when we talk about urbanization is very, very much close to social work. Why? Because there are many social problems that are created in the urban center. And if you do not understand the dynamics of urbanization and urban centers, you may not be able to appreciate the reasons why some people need social workers or social work assistants. Okay? 6 million people move from farms to cities. Wow, this is also very interesting. There's a whole literature about the movement of people from rural areas or from the farm to the cities, and what are the consequences of that. Okay, one of the examples of this that made me feel very emotional, I remember when I watched that documentary, was I cannot remember the exact title of the documentary today, but I know I have it in my office. But I watched it on the Twin Cities Public Television in Minnesota. And this was a documentary in a small community close to Mankato, which is a kind of city outside the Twin Cities, some probably 1.5 hour or so drive, or 2 hours. But this guy was living in the Twin Cities. He grew up in this church in a rural community. The church was really doing very well, thriving or whatever. But then he got married in that church. And then one day they told him that the church was going to close. Why? Because there's nothing for the youth to do. By and large, most of them get educated and they move to the city. Some of them do not even remain in Minnesota. They move to other parts of the United States. Okay? So, and then the farmers were not doing very well in their farming, which is a whole different topic about the way farmers are treated in this country. And when I say farmers, I don't mean corporate farmers, but I mean the family farm owners, okay? So anyway, because they were not succeeding or doing very well, it was just the elderly people or whatever, they decided they were going to close the church. And so he decided to do a documentary film about that. So he left Minneapolis and went to do a documentary about that. And amazingly, it was very emotional to see how this church could not be supported anymore because there are not many people. Only elderly people were there, very few. So they decided to donate the church to a museum. And so they brought an equipment that cut the church from its foundation, and they put it on a trailer, and you see it on the road while they're driving it to the museum. And when I saw it, I said, wow, some people think like it is communism or atheism that is killing religion, but here you have a situation that there's no communism, there's no anything like direct attack on religion, but the economic system is making it difficult for the church to survive in rural communities, okay? So there are many factors that compel people to move to the city. Some people who move to the city may be prepared because they have some skills, but some people do not have some skills. So it is a huge adjustment for them. So this brings the question of social work. And then urban growth was haphazard, and many social problems were ignored. Haphazard simply means most of the time when these people are moving from rural areas to the urban centers, there's no any clear plan to it. It just really happens. And this was way back. Nowadays, there's much kind of like regulation or something like that. But in those days, before you know what is happening, something is just emerging, and then you have to deal with the consequences. And then steel was the major initial industry to be capitalized in the United States. Steel is a very, very important part of the economy. I remember this book called Asia's Next Industrial Giant, which discusses how South Korea was able to establish herself as a very powerful nation through creating this steel industry. Instead of importing steel, they now were able to create it. When they started, the World Bank warned them that it's not their comparative advantage or something like that. But that success of the Asian steel industry has impacted the U.S. steel industry to the point where it was cheaper to import steel from other parts of the world like Asia, Japan, and South Korea than to produce it here. So you have steel industries like U.S. Steel or Bethlehem Steel that have all disappeared, okay, because they ran into some problems, they cannot compete and things like that. But steel was a major industry that was established or came into existence around this time. And then some of the largest trust companies, also huge multinational or corporations or whatever, came into existence around this time also. So this was like the period that many American capitalism was really kind of becoming strong and becoming dominant. And then efforts of government to regulate big business were largely ineffective. We are still dealing with this issue, amazingly. So pay attention. And what I mean by that is that today in the United States, if you want to regulate business, it generates a lot of controversy. The idea is that if you leave business to be on its own, then everybody is really going to benefit from that. So sometimes there's something we call state capture. State capture simply means here are government officials who are going to make decisions about the economy and the society on behalf of everyone in the society. But some of these corporations or lobbying groups go and kind of give money to these people during election campaign and something like that. So when these politicians or when these officials are in office, they end up doing just what these corporate lobbyists ask them to really do. What we really need is a kind of balance, okay? We definitely need corporations in order to thrive and flourish, okay, as a society. But we also do not want a situation where the state bureaucrats, legislature, and everything, the executive are doing nothing but just doing what the corporations ask them to do. Because then what is going to happen in that time is that some people are going to be left behind. So as a result of that, we have what I call the yawning gap between the rich and the poor. Okay, so during this period, for instance, income and wealth was highly concentrated. Amazingly, this was between 1900 to 1930, but we're still dealing with this issue. We are still dealing with this issue with the idea of income being highly concentrated. I was listening to a lecture by Michael Sandel, who is a professor at Harvard University. And he gave this example that if you calculate the amount of money that Bill Gates make per minute, given his income, he said if Bill Gates were to get out of his house and if there's a $1,000 bill in the United States and he found a $1,000 bill on the ground, it will be a waste of time for him to bend down and take that $1,000 bill. He will just ignore it because the amount of money he's making per minute is more than $1,000. Okay? So, I'm not saying this. Michael Sandel just said this just to show you the gap. Meanwhile, if you drive around, you are going to find some people who are begging for some money to go and have lunch or to get a cup of coffee or something like that. Okay? So the idea is not that it's not demonizing Bill Gates, but to show you the yawning gap between the rich and the poor. Okay. I want to make 2 points about the next one, which is rising wages and relatively steady employment meant working class incomes rose, but they rise at a much slower rate than the wealthy. So what does this mean? Well, 2 points. Even when we are talking about just the workers who are below the elites or who are below the capitalist class, you can call them middle class, upper middle class, middle class, and lower middle class, and the working class. Sometimes you may find a situation where some of these people may be doing better than others. And the example here is indicating that there are certain people who had steady jobs, steady employment. So even though other workers are not doing very well, but they seem to be doing relatively good. But the second point also is that even though they are doing good, but the rate or the pace at which they are doing good is not the same as that of the upper class, if you like, or the capitalist class or the elite class. So this is something that I think is really, really very important. It's been very important because maybe if the elite, and John Rawls made this argument, for instance, one of his arguments in his theory of justice is that we cannot create, of course, a society where everybody is equal, okay? But his argument is that any kind of improvement in the society in terms of productivity or income or something like that should not make the person at the bottom worse off. In other words, he doesn't expect the benefit that the people at the bottom will receive will be exactly the same as the people at the top, but at least they should not be worse off. But in this case, there are situations where sometimes economic productivity is increasing, but at the expense of some people's life. It is making some people's life worse off, okay? But if we can have a situation where productivity is increasing and some people at the top are making more money or whatever, but even as they are making more money, it is significantly improving the lives of the people who are considered the least advantaged. The least advantaged means the people at the bottom, because they are the people that we should be very, very concerned really about, okay?